It's nice to see quite some people in the hall. The post-lunch session is always the most challenging to keep people awake after such a nice lunch. So, I primarily research intersections, gender, disability are my core concerns, but I also work on other forms of marginalization. So what I'll be talking about here is about domestic violence and women from the margins, and basically this is part of the studies that we have done. So I'm reflecting from the field there. So domestic violence, I'm sure people are aware about how it has been conceptualized. What we know about it is that it is all pervasive, that it is found in all kinds of groups, whether it is class, whether it is caste, religious groups, or any other social category that you would like to identify. Domestic violence is found in all these kinds of groups, and even groups that identify by culture. What really happens I think across the globe, but specifically in India, women are socialized from their very childhood to accept, tolerate and rationalize violence. So if I'm being beaten up, then it must be my fault that I haven't done something well. So we are even rationalizing the violence that is happening to us. Of course, tolerate it. Tolerate it in the extent that you shouldn't speak a word against your family. And therefore, the domestic violence therefore remains a phenomena that is very difficult to address, if at all to change in terms of its incidence and prevalence. Women face physical, economic and emotional violence within their homes and by persons with whom they have very close affective ties. So, in a sense, when we talk about violence against women, and we have talked about historically in India about violence against women as happening from the outside. So, the public space was the space which was considered to be very, very dangerous for women. But when we talk about domestic violence, we are talking about violence within the most intimate spaces, within the most affective spaces, by the people who are supposedly the ones who love us the most. And this is where domestic violence really becomes very important to talk about, because with people with whom we have very close emotional bonds, and these are the people who are inflicting the violence. And these everyday forms of violence, these are happening every day, in very small ways. You cannot see it always, as in you will not see someone coming and beating me up, but you can see every day people in the family saying, "Can you do this? Are you sure you can do this?" So this is a form of undermining my confidence, and this is as much a violence as probably preventing me from stepping outside the house. So these are everyday forms of violence, and these are happening within the normal and the routine. And this is what also needs to be understood in terms of domestic violence. That it is not a rape case that has happened and has vast media coverage. It is something very small but happening on a like seemingly normal and the routine. And therefore what happens here is there is oppression, but oppression of women is multiplied by location at the intersection. And these intersections could be any one of this: race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation. And there can be, you can add on these systems of oppression and discrimination depending on the cultural context that we can find ourselves in. So this is the background of domestic violence, against which I am going to be locating two groups of marginal women. One is women who are identified as lesbians, and the second is women who identify as disabled. So these are the two groups of women that I am looking at: lesbian women and disabled women. So when we look at domestic violence and lesbian women, the first thing that can be said is this begins at the point that they start realizing that their identity is different from the heteronormative identity that is being pushed onto them. So this is the point where the heteropatriarchal structures, they start kicking in. The moment that I decide that I do not want to be of the pattern that my family is pushing me into, and maybe I speak up against it, this is the point that violence begins. And the natal family here, and if I may point out, both these groups of women, I am going to be talking primarily about the natal family and natal family violence. Probably more so because natal family violence is not talked about much in the domestic violence discourse. In the domestic violence discourse, usually we always say it is the in-laws that perpetrate violence. And here, because I have picked up these two groups of marginal women, for both these two groups, it is the natal family that is the site of violence. So here the family becomes the institution of violence, where for everyday living there is a struggle. And the struggle means that there is a negotiation with for the non-heteronormative individual who wants to survive with their identities, but is actually being constrained by the normative social structures and institutions. And this becomes very, very problematic. Along with physical violence, there is emotional violence, economic and sexual violence, which happens on a regular basis, and I'll come to that in a little bit. And in most cases, the family themselves does not believe that they have done anything wrong. They believe that this is the way to restrain, this is the way to socialize the girl who wants a different sexual identity, to socialize her into the normative heteropatriarchal structures. And therefore, this violence is invisibilized and denied. So it doesn't exist for most people, it doesn't exist. And what are these things? Therefore, for lesbian women, the families are experienced as very violent families. And what are these forms of violence that they experience? One is the moment you come out and say, admit to your family that you have a sexual orientation which is different. The first thing that is done is forceful physical confinement within the home. As if, because she's going out, she's being corrupted by these bad influences. So you keep her within the house. Also, the fact that then she cannot go out and meet her partner. And by that you are constraining her sexuality in different ways. So there's a lot of physical coercion that happens. For the other thing that happens is immediate denial of access to all documents. And documents are things that you might need if you want to exist independently. So wanting to exist independently outside the family with your partner is something that is frowned. And therefore, the ration card, the Aadhaar card, all your identity documents are the first, and your qualification documents, because then you cannot go out and get any kind of job, which means you remain dependent on the family that is your natal family. There's a lot of psychological violence that happens. Forcibly taking to counselors and counseling centers, given a lot of psychiatric treatment, a range of psychiatric treatment to make her believe that she is actually behaving in an abnormal manner, and therefore she should come back to behaving in a normal manner. So this normal, abnormal are categories that really impinge on lives of both lesbian women in a different way and disabled women. And they are also given drugs, electric shocks, etc. for rectification. Many lesbian women that we have spoken to as part of our research have actually confessed that they underwent years of treatment before they could escape such an oppressive situation. Verbal abuse on a continuous basis, on an everyday basis, and this leads to a lot of emotional trauma. Sexual violation, and this is something that a lot of women have said, that there is actually corrective rape. As if you rape the lesbian woman, you can make her suddenly heteronormative. So this sexual violation to cure them of these wrongful tendencies and bring them back to the mainstream ways of life and living. And this is a really painful situation. And this is also something, and I've come to it again when I'm talking about seeking help. A lot of women can't even complain against this kind of behavior because it happens within the confines of the home. And again, cure can be through marriage. So you forcibly marry her off to someone and forget about how unhappy she is in that marriage, but at least you have adhered to the norm by forcing her into marriage. So this is what the lesbian women talk about. For disabled women, it is very interesting how the picture really changes, though the violence remains the same. For disabled women, the violence is very insidious and latent. It is not visible. You cannot really see it. And this emerges again during adolescence, not because they are girls, but also because they are represented as incapable of either productive labor or reproductive labor. And that is what a woman is meant to be, right? Either you do productive activity or you reproduce. And if you are not capable of any of these, then you are of course represented as incapable of anything. So the other reason for eruption of violence in domestic spaces is because they are perceived to be unmanageable. Girls are brought up in our country to be married off and be passed on to some other family. So that is where the natal family's responsibility really ends. But in this case, because they are not capable of productive and reproductive labor, therefore the question of marriage does not arise. So because of this perception of their unmarriageability, the violence is escalated, especially when these girls move from adolescence towards adulthood. And what is very clear in case of disabled girls is neglect on one side and overprotection on the other side. Both are equally harmful, because by neglect you are not allowing the person to develop, and by overprotection you are also not allowing the person to develop, because everything that she wants to do you say, oh, you can't do this because you are disabled. You can't go out of the home. How can you go out for higher education? How can you go to work? So you don't go to work, you sit at home. The more you sit at home, more you confirm the cultural idea that you are unproductive. And that is what the vicious cycle continues. So for disabled women, we actually have benevolent families. So for lesbian women, we have really violent families. But for the disabled women, we have benevolent families. We are taking care of you so nicely. Why do you want to do something more? And that is what becomes more problematic. So girls are treated as special. You're so special, you're so different. And in childhood, that is really the story where they are closeted and really catered to, and everything that they say is listened to by the people in the family. But what really happens is, there is also a lot of deprivation of opportunities. Don't go out to play. How can you go out to play? Who will play with you? Don't go out. You don't have to learn any other skill other than your studies. Education only up to the level that you can manage. It's okay if you don't study. And it's okay if you drop out of school at a certain level, because we know you're disabled, you cannot study. So this is the kind of discourse in which this entire growing up of the disabled girl is framed. But what also happens, and this happens in rural areas, we found a lot of girls talking about deaf girls. Some girls with intellectual impairments for whom they also tried to express, and for whom the sisters often said that, you know, when my mother assigned some task and she couldn't do it because she didn't hear it or understand it well, she was punished a lot because she did not do work well. And so this is a thing that comes up, it is not reflected as domestic violence, but it is a form of violence where the girl is continuously punished because of her disability, she's not able to understand what is being asked. A lot of desexing happens, and for disabled girls this happens very clearly. The desexing happens in the sense that during adolescence, girls are suddenly, from childhood they are brought up as girls. During adolescence, suddenly the family realizes, well, this girl is not going to get married and go away. So we have to curb her aspirations for marriage. And this is done through the desexing. And desexing happens into both ways. One is denial of your sexuality. Many girls have said that, my grandmother used to say, you will live in this house like a boy. You will stay here as a boy. You don't have to be like other girls who get married and go away. This is a very nuanced way of desexing. It doesn't deny her sex, but it also passes on the message that don't dream of the things that the other girls of the family are dreaming about. The desexing also happens in the way the clothes that they are given. After a certain age, girls graduate from skirt blouses to salwar kameezes. In India at least that happens. Salwar kameezes and then maybe to saris. Disabled girls never get out of their skirts and blouses. Most of them remain in that. Some people who have agency, who have money in their hands, can later buy salwar kameezes. But a lot of girls remain frozen in adolescence. And this is as much a violence as anything else. A lot of silences. So there were girls who told us that, my younger sisters were getting married, but no one spoke about my marriage. So the silences that are cultivated within the natal family is as violent as openly telling her you can't get married. And these are conversations that never happened within the family at all, leave alone the freedom to get married. A lot of women have talked about denial of disability-related services. And this is something which has come up in the urban areas very clearly. They were going to some NGO for, say, physiotherapy, occupational therapy. Suddenly one fine day, when the harem of the family passes from the father to the brother, suddenly there are no more funds available for taking her to the agency for her services. So, denial of the disability-related services actually leads to increase in the degree of disability. And this is happening to a lot of women. Even denial of medicines that are required for a lot of disabled women to function properly are also part of the violence. And we don't think about this. Denial of property rights, and very clearly many disabled girls have told us is that we were thrown out of the property rights by lawyers who told the family that these are disabled girls and they cannot inherit the family property. Rather, it is always said that the brothers will inherit and hold it in trust for the sisters. But what is the guarantee that the brothers will take care of the sisters? And if she has a property in her own name, maybe the sisters and the brothers and the sisters will look after her, because then the property can pass to them. So this is something very, very important. Now if I move to seeking help, and this is very interesting because the ways of seeking help when faced with domestic violence are also very different. So when we look at lesbian women, there was very clear barrier in coming out and seeking help because they did not want to shame their own family. And this also happens to a lot of disabled women who don't want to speak up against their own families. What happens after this is they start blaming themselves. That, something must be wrong with me. There's something problematic with me. So they start blaming themselves. There's a big fear of approaching police or the legal mechanisms because they think that they will be doubly victimized. Because we have something called 377 in India, and this Article 377 in the Indian Penal Code has criminalized same-sex relationships up to a point of time. The scenario has recently changed, but the fact remains that the people who are so-called upholders of justice are part of the same cultural ethos that believes that same-sex relationships are a problem. So these are the people who will doubly victimize them. And lot of case studies are actually there, not with regarding to domestic violence. Lot of studies are there which have shown that how police have outed people when they have gone to seek help. So this outing, the fear of outing and the fear of police is a problem. There's a complete lack of sensitization of the police force in India, and they believe that they can actually crack jokes at the expense of people who indulge in same-sex relationships. So what they do, they reach out to queer collectives and queer safe spaces. And during COVID, that was very much the practice, because these were the only spaces, the helplines and these physical spaces were the only spaces where they could go for any kind of support. And for disabled women, same thing. I mean, there's invisible violence. You can't even see it or identify it. And therefore what happens is, the lesbian women said we can't complain against our family, the disabled women also said we can't complain against the family, because the family is such a benevolent family. The family takes care of me so much. How can I complain against it? And if I complain, who's going to believe me? Because ultimately they will say that, oh, your family is taking care of you so nicely and you're complaining against your family. So the benevolence becomes the reason for not complaining against the family. They were also aware of the fact that they were dependent on families and they needed a lot of care. So how do you address this question of care and dependence and go out and complain against the natal families? Access to support mechanisms are limited, and for disabled women it is even more so, because they have very poor digital access, they have very poor access to people outside the family. So how can they even lodge a complaint or go to the court or to the police station if required? So the support mechanisms are very limited access. The legal mechanisms are even less accessible. And in conclusion, I would like to bring out these few points that natal family violence, domestic violence is very, very high. It's visible in certain cases, it's invisible in other cases. And we are not programmed to think about natal family violence, particularly for these two groups. As I said, sometimes it's open violence, as in lesbian women, and many times it's latent violence, as we talk about disabled women. What I would like to highlight here is this cultural values of normal and abnormal. And I personally, being a social scientist, maybe I do not understand how we can define a normal, because the normal is as flexible as the abnormal should be. So we use these words often in clinical language, normal, abnormal, but for me, I don't think there is anything that I would identify as normal. For me, normal is as flexible as any criteria can be. So this is what is very important to talk about and question, that how does culture define what is normal, and how can we question this definition of the normal, and how can we question the normalization of the violence that we are looking at. As I said, that recourse to support is limited in different ways. And I want to end by the fact that, families in India, families across the globe are always promoted as a safe space for all people, and especially for women. That's the safest space that you can be. And we are now even having policies to return everybody to the family. So if a child has run away, we have a policy that says repatriation is the best. You have to send the child back to the family. The child may run away again, then you again catch him and return him back to the family, because family is the safest space. So this kind of a discourse needs to be questioned, but because they are some of the most discriminatory and violent spaces, as has been experienced by disabled women and lesbian women. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I'd like to invite the chairpersons of the session on the dais. I request Dr. Vasilis, Department of Special Education, University of Thessaly, Greece, to please come up on the dais. And I request Hiral, MA student, to please felicitate sir. I request Professor Christopher Johnson, Director, Graduate Studies, Leadership Policy and Development, University of Minneapolis, USA, to please come upon the dais. I request Alfia to please felicitate sir.
Okay, now after this brilliant presentation, of course I would expect some questions in the end of this session. We invite Professor Mary Glasgow Johnson from South Africa, University of South Africa. Her topic is training South African teachers to include learners with autism. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present some of the work that I'm doing. So this is a collaborative research project that I've been involved in for almost 2 years now with a colleague of mine. So my colleague is an expert on augmentative and alternative communication, and she's also done a lot of work in communication support for children who are non-verbal, and also how children use communication devices to communicate their pain in clinical settings. So that's a little bit about who we are. So before I begin, just acknowledgement. So this project has been funded by the South African National Research Foundation. And it's always nice to have money in a project because then you can do things like pay a statistician. Yes, and then we want to thank the participants who shared their experiences, and these were predominantly classroom teachers, but also heads of departments, senior teachers, and principals.
Is the mic on?
Yes, can you not hear me?
Is the mic on?
Yes, it is. Yeah. We have 9 provinces in South Africa, and the research was undertaken in the Eastern Cape. So just a quick outline of the presentation. So by way of introduction, South Africa, like many other countries, has adopted education for all. We are signatory to a range of international conventions and treaties and agreements. And like many other countries, we struggle with practical application and implementation within our schools and classrooms. So these are the two sort of pillars of inclusion in our South African context. Firstly, we've got the policy on screening, identification, assessment and support. It's a very cumbersome, if you like, I can't think of a better word, because there's in excess of 60 pages of forms that the teacher has to complete when the child has been identified as having any condition that requires additional support. And so that administrative workload that it immediately creates, discourages the implementation. This is why, if teachers argue that it's not just the administrative burden, but inclusion demands more from them, it is a heavy workload, altogether, then we can understand where that comes from. And then our national curriculum, the mandated curriculum, it has gone through many changes in the past 30 years. The national curriculum statement is a current policy, and it is accompanied by guidelines for responding to learner diversity in the classroom. So what we're troubled by is why, if these guidelines and policy, the practical application protocols and procedures have been developed and have been given to teachers, why then are they not complying and not implementing in their classrooms? Okay, so the possible reasons, according to the literature, is the lack of technology, the inadequate teacher education, so that would be both at, pre-service and in-service training. I like the way Basil described it as non-stop training. That's actually what you need. The rigor of a continuous professional development process. And although we've got a system that has professional development points and all of that, it doesn't happen because, teachers want to somehow have, this incentivized. So in this training program, one of the first things I asked us is, when I complete your program, will I have access to promotion? Will I get a bonus check? And so our government has also urged to have these incentives in the past. Now people expect it, okay? And so the one thing that we're looking at is, all the other supports for the implementation of inclusion, like the finances, because we're working with a range of learning support needs and learner diversity, and so you've got to, as other speakers have said, you've got to differentiate. You've got to tailor-make your support. You've got to have the assistive technology and devices to support the learner's participation. So I always remind my students, it's not physical presence, is not access. I still need something more to be able to access the learning opportunity fully. I need to participate fully. And then how will I know is if I'm successful and if I achieve, then, the basics have been there. So we look at Ladi Florian's work and how she unpacks access, participation and achievement. And she's been a consultant to our government on inclusive education sort of policy and more the classroom practice. So we're looking at in this project, teachers' professional personalities and their intentions concerning inclusive teaching. And what are these conditions that teachers need to be able to implement in practice? So our theoretical sort of approach, we've used different approaches for different parts of the study, but for this presentation, I'll be looking at how we've applied andragogy or the adult learning principles. So, you know, they've got to be motivated. They must be intrinsically motivated. They must want to know more. They must be self-directed in the learning. They must want to, you know, positively influence the learner's experience, and they must have a positive learning experience, you know, because the teacher then becomes the learner or the student. They must be ready to learn, and the problem-centered sort of approach to learning. And I'll be describing how we apply all these principles. So, of course, in terms of our research methodology, ethics approval is very stringent in our institution. It has to be. You know, I'm at the University of South Africa. We open distance e-learning. We have 400,000 students and over 10,000 staff. So you've got to regulate, you know, in an environment that's a sort of, you know, a lot can go wrong. Someone used the term, the devil is in the detail. And, you know, when you're in a big institution like this, you've got to be on your toes. So all the permissions and ethics, we have to get additional permission if we do research involving UNISA students, because that data has to be guarded very carefully. And then in this case, we also have to get permission from the relevant government departments and all of that. So it takes a long time to just get all your ducks in a row and all the ethics and permission granted. In our case, it took more than 6 months. And then we use mixed method design. So it was both qualitative and quantitative. Today, I'm just going to briefly share some of the qualitative data, and our setting was Eastern Cape public schools. But the problem with the Eastern Cape is that there's such huge inequality. So in rural parts of the Eastern Cape, it's not unusual to find more than 100 learners in one classroom. But we also had public schools that were autism-specific special schools, where the ratio was as low as 8 to 1 teacher. And I remember saying to the colleagues, because, you know, when I train in-service teachers, I refer to them as colleagues, not students, you know. And you can see they're very unfamiliar with that, you know, the collegial approach. Because we want to really recognize that a teacher brings a lived experience, a practical knowledge. They have prior knowledge. You want to activate that, you know. You don't want to patronize and be condescending. So I'm very aware of how I approach mature students, so not just the adult learning principles, but a real collegial reaching out, you know, try. So we had 300 teachers, but the research is always voluntary. So in the end, we had 129 who actually completed the instruments, the data collection instruments. So we know we had 91% female and 99% teachers. There was one teaching assistant. But with the teaching category, there were also, as you can see on the right-hand side, there were teachers and heads of department, deputy principals and principals, and the age range, the average was 49 years, but there you see the range, and these are the different qualifications. So in the South African context, we're looking at the National Qualifications Framework, where level 4 is equivalent to grade 12 or the end of schooling. And then NQF 5 would be 1 year's additional, usually certificate program. NQF 6 would be a 3-year diploma, and then 7 would be a bachelor's, which is a 4-year program, and so on. And you'll see in the teacher group, we had one of the participants had a PhD. And South Africans are quite infamous for the paper chase. We have huge numbers of postgraduate students in an institution like UNISA because it was in the past correspondence but is now open distance e-learning, and 56% of teachers have been trained by UNISA, and at postgraduate level I think closer to 76%. So we've got huge numbers, and teachers are the most likely to come back after an undergraduate program and do, we have an honors and then a master's and a PhD. Okay, so just quickly, these were the instruments, and you'll see we did pre-training questionnaire, the focus group script. We had 10 participants who volunteered in each of the 5 districts. So 50 people participated in that. And then the same questionnaire was used for pre and post training. But we looked at the demographic information, their knowledge about autism, their knowledge of support, how to support children in the classrooms, so very much the practical sort of pedagogies, the teaching strategies, things like differentiation. The assessment tasks in the program was actually to do a set of differentiated lesson plans where they profile the learner and then identify the strengths and support needs. But very much working to how do I work with the strengths and develop them further, and then how do I provide tailor-made support. And then this perspectives of the teachers towards inclusion, very much related to the attitudes and perceptions, right? So quickly, the findings. So we looked at, look at the knowledge of diversity, the willingness to collaborate with others, to at least see the importance of collaboration. So one thing is, everybody complains, I don't have adequate resources, but this is where the co-teaching also comes in, where we're asking them to work collaboratively and pool your resources, so co-teaching might mean one teaches, one observes, one assists. Our special schools all have 2 teachers in the class. And we're trying to encourage them to work together, but what we find in reality is that there's a power dynamic of the one is the teacher and the other one is only there to assist the teacher. So it doesn't go far enough. And then, the right to quality education, look at that. 5. They all agreed, yes, every learner has the right to education, but that was also now a social pressure aspect, of saying, and these were anonymous, right? Responses, but there was this social pressure to acknowledge that children had the fundamental right, which is guaranteed in our constitution and so on. And then they could identify the signs and causes of autism, and you'll see the appropriate ways to include neither living nor disability. And inclusion also, they agreed, yes, inclusion is possible. And then you'll see we generated these word clouds. Now, I'm very interested in the narratives, how we frame various conditions. You know, and we talk in our South African context about barriers to learning. And then my blind colleagues will caution me and say, I am blind, do not negate my disability. So it's like an ongoing debate. But as a parent practitioner, I have a 15-year-old son on the autism spectrum, and I do not see my son as disabled. I see him as capable. And everything that I communicate with him, it is a great self-awareness that I have high expectations of you. And I say that to him every day, you know. And so I think it's a tricky thing to navigate because he does have challenges. And many people would probably accuse me of negating them. You know what I mean? So it's tricky. It's something that's evolving. You know, I don't have a definite position on, you know, my son and how as a teacher where we've been so schooled in the typical development and the milestones of development. My background is early childhood education. And so when your own child is atypical, you know nothing. You know, you kind of have this stunned disbelief that what now, you know. But I do think, you know, when my son was diagnosed, I already had a PhD. And I was probably a little bit more resilient. So the whole process was accelerated of, I can't sit in the corner and feel sorry for myself, we're wasting time, get on with it, you know. And so I'm very interested in how the students I train, how do they frame the different conditions, because how we frame and define and describe also shows the attitudes we hold, which shape what we do in our classroom practice. And so you'll see this word of disorder. And then some schools on their websites and in the discussions, teachers will even use terms like whole body disease. And that comes from our medical model of disability, you know, that we wanted to treat and cure and, you know, and so we shared this with the teachers in the feedback session and said to them, look at how the 129 of you framed this, you know, and they were surprised to see visually where the emphasis was. And you'll see the, you know, the social communication, that it's about brain development, it's a developmental condition, and you'll see the big focus on behavior and the children's behavior as challenging, and there quickly the causes, and you'll see again the genetic and the environmental. And then the knowledge, and you'll see there again problems, behavior, the communication, the different, the interaction, the repetitive, and what the teachers basically sort of identified. If you look at that quickly, and we see here the attitudes towards inclusion. So 4 on the, you see the highest was out of a possible 5. learn best in special class with support. Emotional behavioral problems are more likely in mainstream classes. The right to special classes. ADHD in mainstream class with support, so you can include learners with ADHD. And this idea, teachers are forced to include despite the increase in their workload. So you'll see they neither agree nor disagree, so there was some ambivalence there. And then the best outcome is in a special class, for learners with special education, what we call ELSA. Most agreed with that. And then you'll see inclusion in mainstream is best option for learners with special education needs. And then again, teacher workload increase, neither agree or disagree. So there was some tension there, because on the whole, in the focus group interviews, they complained. You know, they couldn't resist complaining. And I'll come back to that in a second. So you'll see here the teachers' support. You see here lots of complaints about parents. Parents are disinterested. They dump the children. They rely on the teachers. But you do see, and this is where, you know, like Basil, we would say differentiated instruction is very important. But it's tiny compared to this vague thing around support. Or the, you know, they've got to work, so DBST, that's our district-based support team, that, you know, sits outside the school, who teachers should go, and the SBST is a school-based support team. And they're supposed to have this major role in terms of the identification and support. But they haven't been trained, they haven't been resourced, and they haven't been. So you'll see, look at the big focus on problems. And that's where the blame and complaint, and again, we feel influenced by this medical model. And so a continuation of that, and you'll see, you know, this idea, all you need to do is love them. And you'll see the thing around the emphasis on, we don't need support, the learners need support. And look at the prominence of the word resources. So in developing countries, you know, and low and middle income countries like South Africa, this huge over-reliance on resources, you know you're not going to get it, so it's almost like a go-to excuse of why we can't do much, you know. And then teachers get very offended when I say that, and then I say, but you said it. I'm just telling you what you said. And again, yeah, where the attention falls on social skills and support and concrete learning, and even the word treat, we've got to treat them, like the influence of the medical model constantly. But you'll see that all these came from the teachers' responses on the questionnaires. Sorry, not the questionnaires, on the interviews. And so going back to our theory, so what we did on the need to know, there were follow-up workshops. So we had some face-to-face training, and then afterwards it went online. And every session, at the end of the session, we would ask the students, what would you like to know more about? And then they give us topics that they wanted us to do. So this is quite responsive training, because they sort of zoom in on their biggest challenges. We want you to do practical training on this, and then we actually have hands-on. We do like teach with the teach tasks and demonstrate the use of how to make the activities and how to use them practically. if they said, oh, we're having problems with behavior, we have a set of strategies. These are strategies that you can use. Now go and use them, then you give us feedback. If I've given you 5 strategies, can you add 5 more in your group? So constantly pushing them, you know, share your experience, what is working. We also had like an activity where bring your best activity. What works best in your classroom, in your context, with, you know, your practical realities. What's your most successful activity? Bring and share with the 300 teachers. And that one challenged them, right? And then giving feedback and asking for further, you know, input, constantly sort of having this feeling that we're challenging ourselves, that push the envelope. And my colleague and I were very honest with the students, that we don't know everything. We are also now going to look for additional support. And then we went to organizations like Makaton in South Africa and invited you know, people from other organizations to do a guest lecture. And you know, constantly try and figure out how to support teachers, because we allowed them to sort of, what do you want to know? And but this, the case studies, the hands-on approach, the videos we used, was like, you've put us on the spot, and you should do the same, you know, to meet the needs of your learners in your classrooms. So what we're sort of demonstrating, please go and try and do the same, and then bring and share. And so you can see that, you know, we focus on the beliefs and the attitudes, but what was clear here is that the teachers who were most likely to implement inclusion had some personal connection to the issue. People like me, parents, or people who had long years of experience, they almost seen it all, and they knew that good teaching is inclusive teaching. And so we are continuing to ponder, why is there this breakdown? Where's the blockage? What's causing this? And we think it's this whole medical model of a charitable, you know, so if I include, I'm doing you a favor, and trying to get away from that. And so the one thing, you know, that we found was that inclusion really means teaching to the strengths and the interests of the learners, that there needs to be high expectations or higher expectations, but then people would always caution me and say, yes, but be realistic. And I have found, you know, my husband's a professor of Buddhism, and so we've reflected on, to parents like ourselves, you know, who have PhDs, how do we sort of adjust our expectations of a typically developing child? You know, quite difficult. And then the one thing that surprised us was just the lack of prominence of technology in the study, which also goes back to this idea of whether the participants had high enough expectations, because technology could actually be used to enhance and support learning, and it did need assistive devices. But these teachers did not have the confidence to use the devices for the learners. So it's almost exposed their reluctance more than you know, why was there silence? And then to use a bottom-up approach, because using andragogy and having teachers actually tell us, I want to be trained on this, really made the training more useful to them. Thank you very much.
For the waking everybody up now. Any questions for the presenters? No, everyone's tired. It's been a long conference. All right, so let me summarize in just 2 minutes. First of all, thank you. Amazing speeches, amazing presentations. I think if I could draw one theme between the two, it's that both of you highlighted the lack of awareness that it's not the person that's broken, it's the system. Be it a family system, be it a school system, that there's still a willingness to place blame, quote unquote, on the person who disrupts the normative understanding of what these things should be. And I think the way you pointed out this was in really different and interesting ways. So I'm going to start back to Nandini's paper. I think the biggest takeaway I got from your paper was that violence is not something that is necessarily physical, that it could be pharmaceutical, that it could be emotional, that it could be even around property rights. And I really, really appreciated the way that you expanded the conception of violence and what it means, and the types of violence that youth might face in their families. And then Mary, I think you took a different take, and you equally, the words disorder and support came up a lot, but like you said, I never saw the word barriers. Never once in any of those conversations. So I think it's really helpful to keep that in mind, that in situations where inclusion is hard, it might be that the child is being blamed for that. And it might be that the person who's trying to help them feels like they're doing some sort of good charitable work rather than enacting education, like what they're supposed to be doing. You made a good point that in conditions of huge inequalities, it is really hard to do anything. It's hard to do anything in the class of 100, no matter what. So I think that's an important caveat to everything you said. But I think just to wrap up, I think one of the most promising parts of this training was that you demonstrated and not just told people what to do. And I think that's probably something you should keep talking about in your writing about this, because I don't think that's done enough in this type of training. Thank you everybody for being part of this conversation. I think take a quick stretch break and we'll have an announcement about what's next. Is that right? Don't leave your seats, just stretch if you need to.